And we're back to another episode of Chatting with John P. Today, I'd like to talk to you about Omega watches, specifically vintage, and how they are just growing in value and price so quickly. Vintage Omega is the next vintage Rolex. But first, thank you so much for liking and subscribing. I appreciate it, guys. I really do. I go through the comments, you see it, and I do appreciate it. Thank you so much. And also thank you for checking out delraywatch.com. I've seen a lot of guys check it out and come see what we have to offer and even take advantage of our service because with vintage watches, you need to be servicing them, especially if you want them to work for many, many years into the future. So thank you so much for that, guys, as well. Let's jump on the wrist real quick and check out what I'm wearing. Surprise, surprise, I'm wearing the old vintage Rolex Submariner 16800. I don't know what it's going to take to get this off my wrist. Actually, I've got a Omega Mark IV that's coming out of service today, so I think I might have to slip it on for you guys next time. But for now, it's the vintage Sub. Also made a video about it. Check it out. I think that this watch is going to explode in value the next few years. But anyway, I digress. Let's get into the topic. Omega watches. Now, through the years, Omega has just made some awesome watches, some iconic watches, and this is especially true in the sports watch segment. You've got the Omega Seamaster, you've got the Speedmaster, and you have so many variations of both of these. I mean, you have the Ploprof, you have the Seamaster 300, the 600, the 120. I mean, we're talking vintage at this point, but there are so many iconic Omega watches. Now, with the way that the watch market is currently, we just have a bit of a bull market. Now, the old adage kind of says a rising tide lifts all boats, and that is especially true when the tide is lifting a huge boat that is Omega watches. Now, typically over the years, the vintage watch collectors have been focusing on a few brands, especially the higher end brands. You have Patek, which some of the vintage watches are through the roof in price, but also Rolex. There is nothing more notorious or prevalent in vintage watch collecting than Rolex. I mean, you have all the vintage Daytonas, the Newman, you have all the one-offs, the white gold Daytonas, you have, don't forget, the Submariners. I mean, vintage Rolex is just hot, and it really, in my opinion, kind of started the vintage watch collecting movement. Before this, vintage watches that were not Rolex were kind of just known as old watches, but now what we have is we just have all vintage watches going up in price. This is especially true with major brands, or the blue chip brands like Omega, Rolex, Vacheron, Patek. I mean, the watch brands that are popular today and have a lot of prevalence or a lot of market share in the watch industry, these are also the watch brands that are jumping up in value in vintage. So when you have a brand like Omega that's been slowly building themselves and increasing their quality over the last 15 years to compete with Rolex, I mean, if you look at today's Omega prices for a modern Omega, they're trying to compete with Rolex. Rolex is also kind of rising their prices over the last 15 years, but Omega is slowly trailing behind them. Omega, they used to be a much more inexpensive watch, and now when you go to buy, a Seamaster, you're looking at $5,000. I mean, that not too long ago, that was a Submariner price. It's just unbelievable, and the quality does show. But what's interesting is that the vintage Omegas are also taking that price rise. When you look at vintage Omega, the prices have gone through the roof in the last 3 years. I mean, vintage Omega Seamaster dress watches in stainless steel 5-6 years ago, when I was really starting to get deep into vintage watch collecting, I mean, they were $200. I made a previous video where I mistakenly said you could get a vintage Seamaster in good condition for $200. My head was back 3, 4, 5 years ago, because now these things are $500-$600, and if you're buying from a dealer, $1,000 no problem. Now, to me, that is just an amazing thing. Now, the trend shows that, of course, all vintage watches are growing in price. Omega is not only growing in price to keep up with kind of the price increase of all vintage watches, but they're also growing at an additional rate because of what Omega is doing to their brand today. So it's amazing that Omega is building a stronger and more prestigious brand today, and all of their back catalog is also going up in value. That is amazing that something can swing the value of something that was built 50, 60 years ago, and it's just kind of happening without Omega even really thinking about it. I just find that to be amazing. But nonetheless, if you're interested in vintage Omega, you need to buy right now. There's no time like today to get a better price on a vintage Omega. You're still going to pay a premium, but in the coming years, as Omega builds a stronger brand and their watches have higher retail prices, you're going to be paying much, much, much more for vintage Omega. So let me give you a couple examples of watches that you need to be focusing on with vintage Omega. First, you really need to be looking at the flagship vintage Omega, which is the Omega Seamaster 300. Now, just a couple of years ago, these watches could be had at a few $1,000s. These watches were considered to be a Submariner competitor at the time, and I mean, even the Seamaster is today. But one thing's for sure is these watches are worth more in the last 3 years than ever before. A couple of years ago, they were a few $1,000s, no problem. Now, if you want to buy one of these, not only is it extremely difficult to find one in good condition because there are so few on the market, you're going to pay $10,000, no problem. Now, if the hands have been replaced or maybe it's in bad dial condition, you're going to pay a little bit less, but these watches are $10,000. If it has provenance and was purchased maybe at a military outpost, you're going to pay $15,000 for a watch that was selling at just a few $1,000s a couple of years ago. So if the price increases keep following the trend line, these are going to be worth even more. Moving on to the next watch, vintage Speedmasters. Wow, vintage Speedmasters, because they look so similar and not that much has changed throughout the years for, the Moonwatch Speedmaster. A couple of years ago, even 5-6 years ago, they were worth a couple of $1,000s. Even for a 145.022, just a vintage Speedmaster, these were going for, I don't know, $2,000, $3,000 a few years ago. Now, if you want to buy one, even in bad condition, even from a non-desirable year, you're going to pay $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 for this watch. So if the trend line continues, like I said, you need to buy one now because they're going to be worth even more in the future. And not only will they be worth even more, you're not going to be able to find one in good condition. So if you want one, now is your chance. Now, this isn't even considering the extremely special Speedmasters, the even older Speedmasters, the Ed White, or the ones with the straight lugs. That's not even considering that. I'm just mentioning the regular old vintage Speedmaster. There'll be a picture here. There's a couple of references that I won't get into for this video, but if you want one, get one right now. And lastly, let's just talk about some of the more affordable vintage Omega watches. I mean, we have just kind of the Omega Dynamics or the Omega Seamasters that were dress watches and plated and stainless steel and even gold. When I was just getting into vintage watch collecting seriously, within the last 10 years, these watches could be had at a few $100s in great condition. I remember trolling eBay in my earliest days of watch collecting. The watch industry wasn't as big as it was now, and just going through and just seeing dozens and dozens and dozens of these vintage Seamaster dress watches from, 50s, 60s, 70s, just going for a few $100, sometimes even less, especially at auction, $80. Now, wow. I haven't been in the market for one of these in a while, but, doing a little searching right now, these are sometimes going for $1,000, even more if it comes on, the Omega Beads of Rice bracelet or, other types of bracelets. So it's just the last few years, Omega has just killed it. And by doing so, their vintage watches are also worth so much more. And so yeah, sure, we can look at it like, the glass is, half empty, and we could say, oh, the price has jumped so much, it's just not worth it. That might be the case. Maybe it's not, functionally or quality wise $1,000 watch. You can get a better watch, sure. But if you like vintage Omega and you like these vintage Omega, more affordable vintage Omegas, the vintage Seamasters and whatnot, you should get one now, because I don't see the prices going down anytime soon. I mean, with Omega being such a powerhouse it is today, they would really have to go out of business, close their doors, or completely release new watches that just flopped, and they ended up gray marketing all of them in order for the vintage watches to go down. So if you're on the fence and you're like, wow, $1,000, John, I don't know if I should pay this. This was only $500 a year ago or 2 years ago, and $200 a couple years before. Buy one now. The prices are not going down. Even if you're just on the fence, get one now. You will not be sorry. So I hope this short video was at least a little bit of a call to action, or helped a few of you, just a few of you, that were on the fence about buying vintage Omega to kind of jump over to the other side and make the move. I really do believe strongly in the Omega brand and what they're doing today that's completely driving up the prices of their vintage watches. I mean, to me, Omega is just absolutely on beast mode. I recommend strongly that if you want a vintage Omega, to buy one today, because the prices are not going down and the supply is. So buy one while you can. I think that you will be very, very happy. Thanks again. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I do appreciate it. Leave in the comments below the things you'd like to see. I go through all of it, and I do appreciate it. Make sure to check out delraywatch.com, and also don't forget to follow me on Instagram, TheRealJohnP. This has been another episode of Chatting with John P. Ciao.